Hello, this is my final presentation for environmental science on the ecology and history of the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Arboretum. So back during the Great Depression, most of this 1,200-acre land was used for farming. However, because of the economic hardships of the time, the University of Wisconsin was able to purchase the land at a very inexpensive price. The Great Depression also brought a ready supply of labor. Crews from the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, provided most of the initial labor to plant prairies and woodlands and build the infrastructure within the Arboretum. The land for the Arboretum was largely cultivated fields and pastures bearing little resemblance to its pre-settlement state. The university's first Arboretum committee faced huge challenges in planning its restoration. Among this group were botanist Norman Fassett, landscaper G. William Longnecker, and the wildlife ecologist Aldo Leopold. The foresight of these individuals led to the Arboretum's status as a pioneer in the restoration and management of ecological communities and introduced ecological restoration, that being the process of establishing functioning biological systems that are rich in native species. Efforts have continued over decades with the result that the Arboretum's restored ecosystems are not only the oldest, but also one of the most extensive collections anywhere in the world. Staff at the Arboretum work with scientists, students, and volunteers to restore and protect biological diversity and ecosystem functions. The site is an important outdoor research location for the UW-Madison. The plants and animals, as well as their habitats, are under constant study of botanists, plant pathologists, limnologists, wildlife ecologists, soil scientists, horticulturists, engineers, landscape architects, as well as other professionals. The Arboretum has a wide variety of ecological communities, from prairies and savannas to deciduous forests and conifer forests to wetlands and a variety of horticulture collections. So starting with prairies and savannas, until the mid-1800s, prairies and savannas covered most of southern Wisconsin. Today, thanks to many decades of intensive restoration work at the Arboretum, a succession of more than 300 species of native plants blooms on the property from April through October. The Curtis Prairie is the world's oldest restored prairie. It occupies 60 acres south of the Visitor Center. Many classic experiments with planting techniques and the use of fire in prairie management took place here during the 1930s and 40s. In early fall, this deep soil tallgrass prairie has colorful displays of big blue stem grass and Indian grass towering from 7 to 8 feet tall. Next we have the Green Prairie. This 50-acre restoration lies along the southern boundary of the Arboretum. Botanist Henry Green planted more than 130 species beginning in 1942 and laid out the existing trail system in 1961. In summer, the prairie wildflowers are especially showy against the background of shorter prairie grasses, including little blue stem and prairie dropseed. Unfortunately, this prairie is threatened by stormwater runoff from off-site, and I will talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the video. So the Winger Oak Savanna. Oak savannas are a species-rich ecological community characterized by frequent fire and open-grown trees. Though savannas once dominated the landscape of southern Wisconsin, ecologists know little about their composition, structure, and dynamics. Research at the Arboretum is helping to solve these mysteries, though, through the experimental reassembly of these endangered landscapes. The Southwest Grady Oak Savanna. Acorns were planted in former farm fields beginning in the 1950s. This savanna includes the Grady Dry Oak Woods, which is part of the complex of southern Wisconsin fire-adapted communities. Next, we have deciduous forests. So the No Woods, NOE Woods, contains 41 acres of white and black oaks, typical of many woods that developed on former savanna sites after settlement put an end to the fires. Most of the larger oaks are now about 150 years old, but the diversity of ground layer species has greatly diminished since the fires were stopped. Winger Woods and Gallistel Woods. This large block of oak woods south of Lake Wingra was underplanted with sugar maple, basswood, and beech, trees that can grow in the shade of oaks. Basswood, planted in the 1940s, began producing seedlings in 1971, with sugar maple seedlings appearing soon after. It's gradually changing into a shady forest with sugar maple as the dominant species. In Winger Woods on the north slope of the hill, foresters also planted hemlock and yellow birch to replicate the forests of northern Wisconsin. A small tornado did, in 2004, unfortunately knock down about 90 trees. However, downed and damaged trees are providing increased nesting sites for cavity-dwelling birds and denning animals. Gallisto Woods, a 28-acre plot on the south slope, represents the southern Wisconsin, mesic forest. Both contain ancient burial mounds, relics of a Native American culture that flourished here between 650 and 1200 years ago. Next up is the conifer forests, representing the third major biome in Wisconsin. Conifers were among the first plantings after the founding of the Arboretum. Studies have shown that while the pines grew quickly, the soils were not similar to the natural pine forest soils, and the climate of southern Wisconsin is dissimilar to the northern Wisconsin. So planting of the understory species has been less successful. Leopold pines, begun in 1932, when large white pines were moved from a former nursery on Seminole Highway. CCC crews planted most of the red and white pines in this 21-acre stand between 1935 and 1937, along with small numbers of red maple and white birch. In 1955, the pine planting was added east of No Woods. By cutting selected trees, our ecologist hopes to create an old growth structure in a relatively short time. Next up, the Arboretum has many wetlands. Species richness in shallow water habitats at the Arboretum is diminishing due to a long history of modified water levels and aggressive plant invasions. Research on the Arboretum wetlands focuses on how to restore biodiversity in these areas. So first up, the Gardner Marsh. This wetland, site of a failed residential development in the early 1900s, once supported wild rice. While native plants such as sedge species and blue joint grass still persist, it is now dominated by cattails and reed canary grass. Its inaccessibility does provide a wildlife refuge. The Teal Pond wetlands. There's a boardwalk that leads visitors through this sedge meadow. It's near Curtis Prairie, where major restoration has been occurring. The Redwing Marsh. This area offers a good spot to see red-winged blackbirds and waterfowl among the cattails. Extensive studies of blackbird behavior have been conducted here. One of the most unique things about our Arboretum is the horticulture collections. The Longnecker Horticulture Gardens is a 35-acre area north of the Visitor Center, and it displays ornamental trees and shrubs. Two main highlights of the area are outstanding collections of lilacs and flowering crabapples, which typically bloom in May. Garden specimens are labeled, usually with a tag attached to the south-facing branch. The Viburnum Garden is located south of the intersection of Nakoma Road and Manitou Way. This garden features more than 80 species and varieties of viburnum and 110 species and varieties of arbor vitae. So last but not least, the Wisconsin Native Plant Garden. This is a 4-acre garden surrounding the Visitor Center houses, approximately 300 native Wisconsin plant species, and serves as an introduction to ecological restoration and the restored plant communities throughout the Arboretum. It demonstrates how to incorporate native plants into home landscapes. So like I said before, we're going to be coming up to some pictures here. One of the problems facing the Arboretum is that of unmanaged stormwater runoff. Almost here we can see a storm drain that's been frozen over. Almost a fifth of green prairie is now overgrown with reed canary grass. Reed canary grass is an invasive, non-native species that outcompetes many native species. You can see a lot of flooding in this picture here. It forms large single-species strands with other species not able to compete. The Arboretum, in an attempt to fight back against this threat, has been consecutively burning the area during the spring and fall months.